Welcome back. From one unresolved conflict and humanitarian crisis to the next. Yemen, Myanmar, Syria. The UN is still struggling to live up to the first and most fundamental commitment in its charter. We, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. And of course, all too often, it is power politics that determines the UN's course of action. Here's our Bigger Than Five brief. When the UN Charter was signed 73 years ago, 50 nations came together with one goal: building a peaceful world after years of war. Today, the 193 member states have pledged to uphold the principles on which the global organization was built. But is the United Nations living up to its promise of delivering for those who need it the most?
Some people are making it through today because of the United Nations. People who rely on emergency food aid, who are in a war zone. For these people, the UN is delivering. But if you're living in Idlib, Syria right now, today, and you're under the threat of being demolished by a Syrian government barrel bomb or a Russian missile or maybe chemical weapons that everyone will deny using, for you, the UN has been a big, fat failure.
Hello! A failure indeed. While the UN has been successful in providing humanitarian aid and assistance to millions of people around the world, it has been unable to address some of the world's most pressing issues.
Politics has always handcuffed the UN, and it always will. So anytime you want to do something substantive in the Security Council on Myanmar, you have to go through China. Just like if you want to do something on Israel in the Security Council, you have to go through the United States. If you want to do something on Syria, you need to go through Russia.
With these permanent members of the Security Council holding the key, there are growing questions about the UN's credibility and its continued relevance. And if the UN cannot take urgent action to solve the world's ongoing conflicts and crises, it could soon be facing a crisis of its own, a crisis of survival. Well, one of the UN agencies facing a serious survival crisis is the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, which provides education, health and social services to 5 million registered Palestinian refugees. Today, it is left without its single biggest donor, the United States. The Trump administration's decision to cut all funding to the agency means that Palestinian families are already feeling the impact.
احنا بنعتمد على وكالة الغوث بشكل كبير جدا. الصحة والتعليم والبطالة والغذاء. إذا قطعت الصحة مين يعطينا صحة؟ تعليم أين سدادها بالآلاف من الأطفال؟ إذا سكروا المدارس وكان وين يتعلموا؟ يضلهم في الشوارع. قصة الكابونات هناك في معلومات يقول بدهم يقطعوها. نتمنى من الوكالة أنها تسعى ما تقطع هذه الكابونات. هناك آلاف من الأسر الفقيرة تعتمد على وكالة الغوث. إذا قطعت أين ستذهب الناس؟ وقتل الغوث حينما يصير حروب نذهب إلى المدارس تؤمن لنا الطعام والأمان. نتمنى على وكالة الغوث ما تترك غزة لوحدها.
Of course, the impact on refugees like Salman in Gaza is shared, of course, by millions across the West Bank, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, for whom UNRWA represents a critical lifeline. Peter Kayenbühl, the Commissioner General of UNRWA, joins me now to discuss the situation. Thank you very much, Mr. Kayenbühl. Give us a sense of how significant the $300 million US cut to UNRWA, which is, I believe, about a quarter of the budget, is for Palestinians, not just in Gaza, but in all these other countries as well.
Well, there was two types of impacts. One was an emotional impact because it came so quickly, this announcement after the debate on Jerusalem and the transfer of the embassy. So Palestine refugees saw the issue of Jerusalem, then the refugee issue. So that was a very emotional impact for them and a big worry about what would happen in the future. And then there's the concrete impact that we saw in your report for people from education, healthcare, and others. People were extremely worried about that.
But how worried are you about an implosion in Gaza, in the West Bank? Because clearly for this US administration, education, health, development for the Palestinian is not a priority. The Israeli Army Chief of Staff warned that he fears that this could actually have a major impact, that it could lead to an outbreak of violence. Do you share these concerns?
Well, education, healthcare, and our emergency services are a priority for us. And we're not going to abandon Gaza, we're not going to abandon Palestine refugees in the West Bank or in Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. That's what we are mandated to do, and we will stand very firm. And I've told Palestine refugees we are not going to fail them in that sense. Now, the challenge in financial terms was huge, and that's why we launched immediately early in the year a campaign called Dignity is Priceless to mobilize support from other actors. That's really our responsibility.
But can you cope without reducing some of your assistance? And when you say mobilize support, which countries are you mostly looking to fill this gap?
So the mobilization focused on all countries of the General Assembly of the United Nations, but we had very strong response from countries in the Gulf, from Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the Emirates, and currently we are discussing with Kuwait still actively. We had in Asia, for example, Japan, but also China, and we had Indonesia and Malaysia very interested to support us, several European countries and Canada.
But these are still commitments, and we know
history
shows us that commitments don't always translate into urgent
these are more than
action.
commitments. And the beautiful thing about UNRWA is that we felt such solidarity that out of the $446 million that we needed to close as a shortfall this year, we've already mobilized over 260 million. And that's concrete money that has reached UNRWA. And so, you have to understand there's a very positive dynamic. We had statements from the French president, from the Jordanian king, here in New York again, about the need to mobilize additional support. So we're seeing a lot of things moving, actually.
But you're seeing enough movement to suggest that at this stage you shouldn't be worried about a cash flow crisis, that you have enough money coming and that you can survive like this for a while?
No, it's a very difficult year. It's existential in terms of threat, and we still need $186 million. So it's a very big piece. But of course, the responsibility that we feel when we just saw in your report, the family, or when I see the students, the 500,000 students in our schools, I just cannot imagine going back to them when they show courage every single day when they go to the schools through checkpoints in the West Bank or surviving in the middle of the Syrian conflict. And I would go back to them and say, we have failed to mobilize the money. I just can't imagine that.
And by mobilizing the money, though, because I think that's your only solution, aren't you in a way easing the pressure off the Americans and the Israelis? Because after all, UNRWA, through its generous donations, is stepping in to render services that really should be the services rendered by the occupying power, by Israel.
The only pressure I'm interested in easing is the pressure on the Palestine refugee community, and they face so much pressure in their life from occupation, blockade, lack of freedom of movement, lack of employment opportunities, a lack of horizon. Anything I can do, and together with my colleagues, to ease that pressure is what is important, because that's the mandate we were given. We're not an organization that was self-created one morning by a group of friends. It's the very General Assembly that we're here in New York with that tasked us to do this. And so we will knock on every door, and it's not up to a single individual donor to define, the destiny of this organization.
But in terms of the destiny of the organization, when you look to the future of the organization, it's been heavily criticized by the US for giving Palestinian refugees so-called exceptional status and rights, in that you refer to refugees, anyone who is a new generation refugee is referred to a refugee. But is international law clear on this? Should all Palestinians be considered refugees,
yes,
not just those who fled the 48 violence?
It's a very important point, because that is one of the greatest misrepresentations in the debate around UNRWA. It's a spectacular misrepresentation, actually, because it suggests that Palestine refugees are the only ones that inherit the status of the refugees, and sort of descendants are considered as refugees as well. Well, think about the Afghan refugees. Now for 40 years in Peshawar and the camps in Pakistan. And of course UNHCR considers their children and grandchildren as refugees, just as UNRWA does the Palestine refugee children and grandchildren. So there's no difference in that.
So what is the end game here for the Israelis and the Americans? Is it putting the Palestinian refugee crisis issue to rest once and for all, with the first step being the dismantling of UNRWA?
Well, that may be a temptation for some, but the point I think one has to have in mind is you cannot simply wish 5.3 million people away. And whether UNRWA exists today or doesn't exist tomorrow, that isn't the point. The people will be there. And solutions, political solutions, have to be inclusive of Palestine refugees as they have to be of refugees elsewhere. Otherwise, you don't stabilize the region.
But how much is the political issue, though, have to do with the desire by some, certainly the US administration, to possibly strip refugees, Palestinian refugees, of their refugee status? That this goes beyond the financial
aid. Well,
aid.
The refugee status, and in particular also the Palestine refugee status, is a matter for the General Assembly. That's a definition that has been approved by the General Assembly. And so it's not for an individual member state to define a change in that regard.
So
it can
should
be
there
debated.
be an emergency session of the General Assembly to deal with this?
I don't think so. I think the issue of definitions and others is maybe there's a temptation or a desire to reduce the experiences of Palestine refugees, to minimize them, to at times even delegitimize them. But my point about this is, however strongly these attempts are made, the reality is Palestine refugees have rights under international law, and UNRWA is an expression of the collective commitment of the international community through the General Assembly and renewed regularly over the past decades to provide support, assistance, and protection to this community.
40 US members of Congress have called on President Trump to reverse all of these policies against the Palestinians, not just the defunding of UNRWA, but also the $200 million in humanitarian aid, $25 million to hospitals in East Jerusalem. What are you telling your US interlocutors, your Israeli ones as well?
I say to the US that, first of all, UNRWA recognizes, and I personally recognize, the extraordinary contributions that have come from US throughout the administrations and across, and it has always been a bipartisan support, that the idea that humanitarian assistance, despite tensions and differences of opinion that can exist between the US administration and the Palestinian leadership, there has always been protection towards humanitarian funding. And this is the part that I regret in the decision that was taken now by the US administration, because it politicizes humanitarian aid, which should absolutely be prevented. We work in a very difficult environment. UNRWA, like other humanitarian organizations, exist because wars inflict human suffering on a very large scale. And so we're there on these front lines. We've lost a lot of colleagues in Gaza and Syria, as a reminder of how concrete is the work and the commitment of this organization to human dignity and to the rights of Palestinian refugees.
And are you hopeful you can keep going?
Oh, we're very determined. We will be there, and we will stand firm.
Pierre Cayenboul, Commissioner General of UNRWA, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much.
From Gaza to Yemen, where the conflict between the government and Houthi rebels is now in its 4th year. With ongoing airstrikes by the Saudi-led coalition, more than 8 million people on the brink of famine and 22 million in desperate need of assistance, the UN Secretary-General calls it the world's worst humanitarian crisis. As the UN engages in yet another round of mediation, Yemenis like Ahmed Ismail are still waiting and searching for answers.
دور الأمم المتحدة سلبي للغاية، خصوصا في القضية اليمنية. صح أنه المبعوث الأممي الجديد حاول أن يرضي جميع الأطراف، لكن في الفترة الأخيرة زادت الضربات والحصار القائم على البلد. حتى الآن أصبحت صنعاء مشلولة في ضرب مستمر وقائم في الحديدة الذي هو مصدر غذائنا أو مصدر استيرادنا للمواد الغذائية والسلعية. الناس كدهم جميعا معتمدين على هذه المواد. الناس بيعانوا معاناة شديدة نتيجة إيش؟ الغلاء الدائم، وإضافة إلى عدم وجود أو عدم توفر المشتقات النفطية. المطلوب من الأمم المتحدة أن تتخذ قراراً صارماً بوقف الحرب.
So how is the United Nations responding to these calls? Martin Griffiths, the UN Secretary-General's Special Envoy for Yemen, spoke to us earlier. Martin Griffiths, thanks so much for joining us, first off. So the Secretary-General of the UN today was again sounding the alarm bell, saying it's an outrage what's going on in Yemen and the fact that the international community has not been able to put a stop to this ongoing war. How would you describe this war? Is it a war in Yemen, a war on Yemen? What's your assessment of the situation?
It's both. I mean, it's a war in Yemen, pitching Yemenis against Yemenis, in which Yemenis are also the main victims, of course. The principal victims of this, as in all other wars, are the people who are caught up in it. It's also a war of great strategic importance. I used to work in Europe, and we used to worry a lot about the Red Sea security and the shipping lanes and so forth. This is because of the instability in Yemen. It's a war for stability in the region, and it is a war in which there are strong regional interests as a result. So it's a complicated war, just like some others in the region, but it's resolvable.
How is it resolvable? What is your game plan? I mean, because the negotiations seem to be stillborn. I mean, are you expecting much to come out of them?
Well, I think the first thing I'd like to say is that although it's been 2 years since the last round of negotiations, in that last round, which was 3 months in Kuwait, pretty well every issue that needed to be negotiated about the eventual settlement of this conflict was negotiated. We don't need to invent anything. It's all set out there in Kuwait according to and within the resolutions of the Council. So we have a big advantage. Again, unlike Syria or elsewhere, we kind of know where we want to get to in terms of what a settlement would look like. That's a massive advantage. All we need to do now is to get the parties together, started on the process of getting to that settlement.
But to what extent is it important to make sure that the Saudis, the Emiratis, and let's face it, their Western backers, the US, the UK, France, how much willingness is there to allow you the political space you need to find a solution when there's a constant, ongoing amount of airstrikes every day?
I think there's quite a lot of space. In fact, within the framework of the interests of the neighbors of Yemen, with their Western backers and so forth. I am continually told, I have been told again here today by one of the ambassadors from those states that you've just mentioned, that any solution has to be Yemeni. I'm continually told this, and I don't think people are lying to me. Solutions do have to be those which conform to Yemeni interests, but they also have to be consistent with the interests of neighboring states.
But exactly, I mean, this is no longer...
It's not a contradiction.
It's no longer a Yemeni conflict, isn't it? I mean, you mentioned the regional strategic importance it has for other powers, not just Saudi Arabia, the UAE, but Iran as well. And let's face it, these countries in the West that give the logistical and intelligence and
it is a Yemeni conflict. It is a Yemeni conflict. It has interests which are non-Yemeni, but it is a Yemeni conflict. It's about the future of Yemen. And as a United Nations official, I insist that the solutions that we arrive at are those agreed to by Yemenis. Now, that doesn't mean to say, and I don't think we're naive enough to think that other interests are not at play here. Of course they are. I frankly don't see them as a constraint on finding a political solution to the conflict, on finding, frankly, arrangements for a government of consensus, that will move us through transition, all the things, again, that were discussed in Kuwait.
Who holds the key, though? Because...
who holds the key?
Who holds the key? Would you say it is Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the coalition, and their Western backers? Or is it the Houthi rebels and Iran? And how much conclusive evidence is there that Iran is backing the rebels?
I don't know the answer to that. There's certainly very strong views on this matter. But again, and I've discussed it, for example, with Ansarallah. I've discussed this with officials in the government of Yemen and the coalition. There's no doubt that the Ansarallah is clear when they say that they get assistance from Iran of different kinds.
Is Iran supplying them with weapons?
That's not my business. My business is to find agreement to stop the conflict. My business is not to judge the performance of the war. That's the business of other people who have pronounced on it. But you said who holds the key? There are many keys to this conflict, just like many other conflicts. Some of those are in Riyadh, some of those are in Yemen, some of those are in Aden. The job of a mediator, of a UN envoy, is to find a situation where all those locks open, and that they open in a way that actually meets the needs of Yemenis.
But is it pointless, though, for you to be trying to find a solution when you've got this asymmetrical conflict going on?
Which internal conflict is not asymmetric? I think all the conflicts I've been dealing with in the last 25 years are asymmetric. Whether it's the Taliban in Afghanistan, whether it's looking at the Kurdish conflict in Turkey, the asymmetry doesn't mean to say that conflicts cannot be resolved.
But are you calling for a truce, for a stop to the bombardments, to be able to achieve your job?
I would love a truce to happen. but I will not make it a condition of talks.
What is the key condition?
A key condition for talks is the presence of both parties to sit down to negotiate an end to this war. You ask any mediator about conditionality, and they will all say, we love to have certain things happen, but we don't want to make them conditions precedent.
But what about stopping the arming of these different groups and factions? I mean, should you make it perhaps a condition that there should be a weapons embargo
There
on
is
all
a weapons
sides?
embargo.
It's clearly not being enforced, is it? When you have some of the member states of the UN using F-16s to bombard the most impoverished country on earth.
You know, you're leading me down the same path that I just said I won't go down, which is, no, I'm sorry, no, my job is not to pronounce on where the weaponry comes from for this war, is to find an end to it. It's a different task.
It's not so much where the weapons come from, but it's how to put an end to their use. Isn't
Exactly,
that something you're
and
looking for?
that is what I'm focused on. That will come through a political settlement.
Finally, how hopeful are you? Because I know you were also involved in mediation efforts within the Syrian context. How much more difficult is the Yemeni crisis for you?
Less so. You know, I really, as you say, I had spent a lot of time on Syria without any noticeable impact. I'd hate Yemen to continue towards where Syria is today. And I fear that it could if we don't get the people around the table to resolve it. Every conflict of this kind that keeps moving always moves in the wrong direction, and our job is to stop it moving and move it back in the right direction. Can be done. Let's hope.
I hope so too. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Despite the UN's failure to help end the war in Yemen and criticisms of inefficiency and political bias, the organization is still a key provider for millions around the world. Aus Haidari with a brief look at some of the UN's most notable achievements in our 5 facts.
The UN assists 68.5 million refugees in 128 countries. With nearly 1 person being forcibly displaced every 2 seconds, UN agencies provide life-saving help to people threatened by violence, conflict, and persecution. The UN saves 3 million children each year. UNICEF and other agencies provide vaccinations for 45% of children under the age of 5 through immunization programs in over 100 countries. The UN provides food to 80 million people annually. The United Nations World Food Programme delivers food assistance in over 80 countries. Each day, over 5,000 trucks, 20 ships, and 92 planes distribute approximately 12.6 billion rations. There are 15 UN peacekeeping operations around the world today. With an annual budget that is less than 0.5% of global military spending, more than 117,000 Blue Helmet peacekeepers work to stabilize some of the world's most volatile conflict zones. These missions are often the difference between life and death for many civilians in these areas. The UN supports reproductive health care in over 150 countries. Through its population fund, every month help is provided to more than 1 million pregnant women who face life-threatening complications. Since the establishment of the fund, nearly 13 million unintended pregnancies, 30,000 maternal deaths, and more than 1 million unsafe abortions were all averted.
For so many, it is this kind of work that continues to make the UN an essential organization. But for the UN's former human rights chief, protecting the organization's ability to deliver will depend on breaking the deadlock inside the Security Council. Zaid Rad al-Hussein shared with us his thoughts and concerns for the UN's future.
In preparing for my post-UN career, I was talking to a publisher, and the publisher was very clear with me. He said that the UN doesn't sell. If you write a book about what's been happening in New York, Geneva, Vienna, no one is really interested, and that is a reflection perhaps of how the public more generally sees the UN, which is sad. On the other hand, and this is a point he also made clear, that the UN does sell when you refer to the activities in the field. You know, all the heroism that humanitarian workers are involved in the most pressing of areas, and human rights officials. And he said that actually does bring some attention to the UN, which is positive, or not just some, a great deal. And so that gives me a sort of indication that we are relevant in the areas that need us the most. Perhaps in the global north, the UN could be more relevant, and if only the mechanisms and systems worked better, such as the UN Security Council in particular.
And you, more than anyone else, in terms of senior leadership at the UN, has spoken out for so many human rights victims around the world.
Yes.
Myanmar, but so many other countries as well. On Syria, for example, or on other issues we often hear about, how do you break the logjam that we see at the Council? Because without the permanent 5 members, nothing really moves.
Yes. I mean, I was astonished when they didn't allow me to speak. We didn't have 9 votes that would have allowed me to speak. And for me, it was an absurd situation, because if we don't discuss gross human rights violations in Syria in the Security Council, what are the Security Council members discussing about Syria? And I said, sort of tongue-in-cheek, are they discussing arts and crafts in Damascus? I mean, it's sort of, there's an absurdity here, and the Security Council really does need to understand more fully that today's gross human rights violations are tomorrow's conflicts. And if they're not attended to, they're not looked at carefully, it becomes almost too late. I mean, there are many extraordinary people in the UN doing amazing work in the field. My concern is that the UN Security Council itself seems to be paralyzed on so many critical issues. I mean, they can't seemingly come out with a resolution on Myanmar, for instance, after what we saw happen to the Rohingya. I mean, and that sort of thing, I think, needs to change. If it continues for another 5-10 years where they're paralyzed, then yes, that the UN may well collapse.
May well collapse if it doesn't change.
It needs to change.
How much do we still need the UN? I know you have worked for most of your career in and at the UN.
Yes.
How much do we still need it for global governance? Or could we think of something else?
Well, it's difficult. I mean, there are certain things that could be reformed, certainly in the UN Security Council. We'd like to see the use of the veto, and when there are atrocity crimes being committed. But again, when I go to visit countries and I see time and again in remote places UN officials doing the most amazing things, it leaves me feeling hopeful, and also their courage is utterly inspirational. So for me, I differentiate between the time when I was a diplomat at the UN and many of the meetings that could be tedious and we don't have an outcome, from the experiences in the field as a UN official working within the UN, where I have nothing but admiration, and I feel inspired by what these UN officials are doing in the field. So it's a complex picture. My feeling is that it's indispensable. We can improve upon it. It needs, the member states to be more determined to support it, not just in words and through speeches, but by real action.
With so much at stake, it is clear that many people here at the United Nations are sounding the alarm bells, not just about threats to the UN's political and financial infrastructure, but threats to its very existence. From me, Ghida Fakhry, and the entire team, thanks for watching.